a little late start. But we appreciate you being here and thank you for sharing the information that you're working on down there.
No problem, and we're happy to wait. Definitely understand how the legislative process works. So very, very pleased to be here today, and thank you to Representative Lookner for catching us and inviting us along. If I share my screen, or is the committee able to see a presentation?
Yes, please do.
Okay, great. So I'm just going to give some background about HOC, and then Zach is going to go into some more detail. So my name is Ken Silverman, for the record. I'm the Director of Government Affairs for HOC. I'm joined by Zachary Marks, who's our Chief Real Estate Officer. Just a quick geography to orient you. We're coming to you from beautiful Montgomery County, Maryland, which is just north of Washington, D.C. Our neighbors on the west is Virginia, and then this is the rest of Maryland to the east. On the right, you can see a map from 1980 master plan, which dedicated about a third of our land area to agricultural use exclusively. So we are a very diverse county, both in terms of population as well as in terms of land use. So we have about a third of the county that's really very rural in character, a large mass of the county that's has a suburban development pattern, and then around the Metro Rail stops that connect us to Washington, D.C., we have some very urban nodes where you would really feel like you're in the middle of a city. We have about 1.1 million residents. We have 4 of the top 10 most diverse cities in the United States. And we are proud to be home to a number of federal agencies that form the backbone of our economy. This is just a little bit about HOC. So the Housing Opportunities Commission is Montgomery County's public housing authority. But we are more than that. Unlike a lot of other public housing authorities across the country, we are also a housing finance agency for the county, which means that we can issue bonds and write loans. We use that authority to support low-cost mortgages for low and moderate income home buyers, as well as finance multifamily development, both our own and third parties. And we are also a public developer. So we own and operate about 9,000 housing units, and we have an ambitious pipeline of almost 3,300 new units coming online in the next 5 years or so. I think one of the things that probably caught Representative Lookner's eye, we've got a bit of national press lately for the Housing Production Fund that we developed, and Zach is going to tell you about that as we go through. So.
Thank you. For the record, Zachary Marks, Chief Real Estate Officer for the Housing Opportunities Commission of Montgomery County. So focusing on the Housing Production Fund, the general idea here, in Maryland, DC, and Northern Virginia, there's something called the Metro Washington Council of Governments, where all the different jurisdictions got together and, among other things, came up with a combined housing goal. And what we have found over the first few years of trying to accomplish that housing goal is that, the for-profit production that's out there, which is mostly your market rate housing, your nonprofit production, which is, mostly your tax credit deals, and some of the work that HOC is doing, which really falls into both of those themes, was really only producing about 60% of that goal. And so HOC wanted to step up with an idea of how to really get the other chunk that wasn't showing up. So to do that, we had to come up with a tool that would not compete or cannibalize those other channels, because we need those housing partners to continue to produce. So idea of the Housing Production Fund was really to take a model that HOC has executed on for many decades, which is this mixed income model, but publicly owned by HOC as a governmental agency. And the council asked us, how can you do more of that? And how can you do more of it in a way that doesn't take away from, isn't basically netted out against, a community that a nonprofit would have built or a for-profit developer would have built. And so the production fund was born out of that idea. But it also, and so the first idea was that it wouldn't really compete with these other sources. The second, though, is that we're falling well short of those goals. And so the program needed to be very simple. It needed to be very fast, and it needed to be scalable. That if this was going to be a reasonable part of the solution to the missing chunk that was supposed to be showing up every year in terms of supply, then this fund needed to accomplish that. And so, the fund that was ultimately created was created in two pieces. It's now a $100 million revolving fund, and we can certainly get into the mechanics of that should you wish. But it's really designed to be construction equity, readily available and low cost at about 5%. That funding is available to HOC to basically be married with both our existing pipeline, but also to give our commission by whom we're governed to be comfortable with, in fact, doing more than we're doing already. So even more than that 3,300 units that Ken told you about, the commission can be more confident about actually pursuing more if we know we have this dedicated available funding. And so the general idea here is that these loans would be made to these projects that HOC is constructing. And those loans are about 5 years, which is generally speaking enough time to build and lease up the building, at which point it's what's called stabilized, where you have enough people in it to pay all your bills, pay your mortgage. And then you can apply what's called permanent financing to it. And HOC, because we are also a housing finance agency, happens to also be in position to do that too. But even if the housing authority and the finance agency were separate, those two agencies could simply work together in this way. But the general idea is to get as many units built as fast as possible, but with the idea that HOC will be the owning and controlling interest in that property. And that brings with it some immediate benefits. So it's first and foremost a production solution. So it's really getting at, many of the, and you've heard a lot of that today in terms of there's this immediate need, and that's what subsidy is all about. But there's also how do we change this thing structurally on the long term, and that's the supply side. This is first and foremost a supply side solution, but we also wanted to pick up some mission along the way. So each of these transactions will have 20% of units at 50% AMI, 10% at Montgomery County's inclusionary zoning limit. If you think about it as just sort of the tax credit maximum, you're not going to be far off. But 30% total affordable. And these because these units are owned by HOC automatically follows as a policy the voluntary rent guideline, which is a voluntary rent stabilization measure that the county's had in place for a long time. So even market rate tenants in units that HOC owns benefit from that rent stabilization measure. Slide to the next slide. So again, emphasizing that speed theme. This is how fast we were able to stand this up and put it to use. So the council passed the first resolution in March 21. So that's that first 50 million. The 100 million was created in those two pieces. The fund was established by August, and that's with really a July 1 fiscal year go live date. And the first loan was made in December. And so you can see that we're already almost a year from the first funds being actually recycled out of the first project loan. And again, that was because this tool didn't invent the business model. The business model had been there for a long time, this public ownership, this mixed income. So we were able to really take this tool and marry it to something that HOC did well, but wasn't doing as much of as it otherwise could have with this funding present. Can you go to the next slide? So some examples of the housing that we've produced here. Because I know for some folks, sometimes the 30% affordability number can be, can raise questions. But this is the mixed income model that HOC has pursued in addition to everything else we do. We do tax credit deals, we do majority and, majority affordable deals too. But this is, again, supposed to be a separate supply side issue, part of the business model that adds to all those other things that all of us are already working real hard to deliver. So one of the things you can see though is that these are also much, much, much larger deals than tax credit deals typically are. So in Montgomery County, the average 4% low-income housing tax credit deal is usually about 132 units. And so in this case, you're getting 30% of much larger properties. And so you're actually getting an embedded tax credit deal. And because of the presence of the Housing Production Fund, we don't actually have to use some of those dear resources that other transactions don't have any other option but tax credits and and soft funding and volume cap and things of that nature. So these are some of the examples. The Laureate is actually now open and leasing. This was the first Housing Production Fund deal. Hillendale Gateway is site work is starting next month. And this is a 463 unit deal. One thing I would emphasize about the HPF is that it's one tool, and as affordable housing practitioners know, we're constantly stacking and layering things on top of each other, whether it's financing or programs or anything else. And so we view this as, we view these housing communities as platforms for other things beyond just housing. And in this case with Hillendale Gateway, we're doing the first two passive house residential apartment communities in the state of Maryland. And one of these will actually be the first net zero residential buildings, I think in like the mid-Atlantic, kind of outside of Boston, New York, places like that. And so, the Housing Production Fund is first and foremost about production, but it is also a platform for some of these other initiatives that the commission finds important. Okay.
I don't know if we want to go through all of these, but
yeah, we can just, here's a couple more examples. Yeah.
More examples in our pipeline. This is a little bit of information about a state bill that's in Maryland this session, which would create a housing innovation fund, would essentially be a matching fund for production by public housing authorities across Maryland. There's many ways to come up with the local match. It doesn't have to require local jurisdictions to create a housing production fund or look exactly like we do. But this was a proposal that we obviously are very supportive of. Zach, do you want to walk through this one?
Yeah, so I think one of the sort of compelling ideas about the production fund is that HOC or any kind of public development entity, this kind of gets to that scalability theme, can be a significant part of the production, the annual production that we need in order to meet goals. So you can see that in sort of 15 through 2021 that HOC was somewhere in the 5 to 8% of the annual permits being pulled, housing permits being pulled. And with the arrival of the HPF, that is expanding HOC's market share to into the double digits, in some years as high as 20% of annual production. And then the final color you see there is an example of what matching, that state bill, the matching funds can do in terms of making a public development arm, a significant viable portion of the annual production. And again, this is not designed to be competitive with other channels. It's designed to be a third channel so that we can hit our housing goals. But some of the upshot of this is that all of the units that get produced in this way stay in governmental control. And so any of those kinds of resident protections, which we'll get to, which really we can flip to the next slide. All of these things come with public ownership, which is that, as I mentioned, we follow the voluntary rent guidelines. So if there is whether there is or is not an appetite for a mandated rent stability measure, this is a way in which to get a significant number of units into rent stability without even needing to mandate it. In terms of services, HOC is one of our strengths is in connecting our residents with all the sorts of services, many of which you've heard today. We connect with the same kinds of great organizations in our neck of the woods, and this would become available to all of the communities in which we are owners. There are these other sort of concurrent public goals of co-location, of public facilities, environmental, and just generally community and economic development. And then lastly, the sort of quiet, most important part of this whole thing is that, as you might imagine, as you pay the mortgage down on your house, you build equity over time. And so think about that idea with public ownership of these sorts of assets, where in 20, 30 years, that same sort of equity, because of this fund and because of HOC's ownership of it, stays inside the government's sphere. So that equity in turn can be used to both maintain these assets well and also to further expand the portfolio.
Now, this is just won't go through all these, but some of HOC's resident services. A lot of we have supportive services, like you heard from a lot of the other panelists today, and as Zach said, these housing units, we're able to provide a direct pipeline from our wait list, from all the other doors that people go in, to have direct access to these units at the affordability levels. And then we can layer in vouchers and other tools to serve, even deeper affordability and different kinds of residents. And this slide summarizes some of the economic impact of HOC's real estate activities for Montgomery County. So we estimate about $3 billion, and this is from 2009 through 2021. So it does not include the impact of the HPF and the development that we've been able to fund there. So we can stop there, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. Very interesting sort of tact you're taking that's different than a lot of places. So are there questions from the committee about Representative Chair Gear, excuse me.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, thanks to you both for being here. This is a really interesting presentation. I think, as we all do, we kind of, in my head, I'm going, okay, what pieces of this do we have in Maine, and how might this kind of fit together? Or how might this accommodate or be able to use the model that you're talking about here today? So a couple of questions have emerged for me as a result. Clearly, your county is, 1/3 the size of Maine. So we're talking, kind of a difference of scale that's pretty significant. And my aunt and uncle lived in Gaithersburg, so I'm very familiar with the level of population and activity that's there. So I will say that, when you think about this kind of a model for a population of a much smaller scale, including a lot of rural areas, what challenges and or opportunities would you foresee? And then also, around the public ownership question, what experience did you all have as the county being the owners of the projects of the buildings, and how did that relate to then creating this strategy moving forward?
Yeah, thank you. Those are excellent questions, because certainly some of the projects that we showed you aren't necessarily going to fit in. They don't even fit in all places of Montgomery County. So the first thing I would say, and then happy to get into more detail, but I would basically put it this way, that the only thing that's really, so this is really the private model of real estate. So if you see a private developer in any of these communities building anything, all that's happening here, because most of the time developers are going to use this. They're going to use private capital. You may have heard it termed as private equity, used to construct these projects. And the only thing that's changing here, and it's a big thing, is that we're removing the private equity and we're replacing it with us. And so and our capital is the cost of our capital at 5% is substantially less than private equity charges. So I would say first and foremost, anywhere in any community you see something getting built by a private developer, this model will work for that because this capital is cheaper and obviously we use that cheapness to install all these other mission driven things. So, but I would say that this is really using something that is about as familiar as it gets. Most of the time, affordable housing finance is mind numbing and Byzantine, but in fact, we're using the finance here is actually the easiest part, right? All it is municipally financing something, which is like about as stone simple and foundational as it gets. So I would say there, you certainly need folks that employed at your public developer, whatever that is, and so we can transition to that understand the communities in which they're producing these developments. So you would certainly want somebody who understands how to produce something, in a rural part of the state, in an urban part of the state, in a suburban part of the state. But the good news is, once again, you can find those folks because this is really commandeering that private model again. So anybody that does this in the private sector can do it here and simply replace the private equity with this equity, and it brings all the control to the government. So that's sort of like the quickest answer I can give to the how does it fit into different areas. I would say in terms of the kinds of entities you need, that's one of the most important questions about this, because as I said, most of the time it's the financing that's complicated, but in this case, it's actually the logistics that's the most complicated. How do you find the necessary experience and talent to come join a public developer? Do you want it in one of your existing entities? Some places have an HOC where they've been doing this for a while. You have no doubts about the business model. They've just been doing 100 units a year and you want them to do 300 units a year. That can be easier. You also might have an existing entity that's fraught with issues and you don't want to give them anything else than you already have. And so other places like Seattle are actually creating a brand new public development entity. And I think either way, as long as the model is there and the commitment of capital is there, you ought to be able to attract people like me who came from the private sector and just simply execute the private model, but do so on behalf of the government at this point.
Great. And can I have a follow-up on that?
Sure.
Yeah. And the other thing that we've, given our smaller population, the thing that I've been thinking a lot about is when we have private developers who are trying to do market rate development, but are running up against significant financing challenges given the current state of affairs. Is there a model that would allow us to incentivize the inclusion of some element of affordable units within those developments in exchange for a public investment, the public financing, and again, some sort of relationship or ownership and management / oversight of those units within that development? Has that, to your knowledge, does that make sense? And is it being done anywhere? Just curious.
Yeah, I was going to say one thing that we didn't really highlight in the presentation is that each of those projects, we have a private development partner, and we have several different partners that we work with across the county. But we work together with them, and some of them, the county or we were able to provide the land. Some of them, the developers had the land and the projects. Some of them they brought fully entitled projects that they couldn't find financing for, and HOC was able to use the Housing Production Fund to help those projects move forward. So as Zach said, we're really seeking to replace that private equity component with a fund that only invests in Montgomery County, and we are looking for opportunities from wherever they come from to move those projects forward.
And just to clarify, so in that scenario, then the services, the wraparound services for the affordable units are still provided by the HOC, basically, and all of your partners that you work with for that. Okay.
Yep, and we could have nonprofit partners as part of those projects, but we do, in all of them, retain at least majority ownership. That's a key part, and we do have that minimum level of affordability.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, very interesting. Any other questions? Representative Lickner.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks both of you for joining us here in Maine and taking time out of your day to tell us how it's working down there. I'm thrilled by your presentation. A lot of what you said was just music to my ears, you know, talking about the Byzantine, complicated nature of housing that is just really, you know, it's overwhelming. And when you're talking about just how simple and scalable this model is, it just makes so much sense to me. Some of the questions that I had, I think the main one is you kept referring to the voluntary rent cap. So even though only 30% of units in a publicly owned mixed income development fall into, you know, 50% AMI affordability, what is that voluntary rent cap and sort of what does that translate to as far as a percentage of AMI?
The voluntary rent guideline is issued by the county each year. It's not an AMI based measure. It's a suggestion for what private landlords should might consider raising their rents based on inflation. So it's basically just taking the regional inflation measure. We are waiting to get the new rent guideline for this year, but we're expecting it's going to be, quite significant compared to previous years. I think over the last 10 years or so, it's hovered around 2%. I don't know. Does that address your question?
Just as far as so a number, like I'm a single person renting an apartment, how much could I expect to pay?
Yeah, I can share. So our current AMI, area median income for Montgomery County, is about $100,000 for one person. So 50%, your income's about $50,000. Then we calculate affordability is spending 30% of your income on rent. So your maximum rent, if you're a single person, would be about $1,200 a month. Which at least for certainly for Montgomery County is quite low. And then if for a family of three, 50% of AMI is about $64,000. So your max rent is going to be about $1,600 a month.
And so just using the combination of voluntary rent guidelines and the AMI affordability, these projects work. Like the revenue, so they're not revenue generate. I mean, maybe they are revenue generators, but they're you're able to maintain them and they're sustainable.
Yeah, I think what Zach was emphasizing is that for the market rate component of the project, so there's no income restriction. The rents are set based on what the market can bear. That's what obviously brings in revenue and makes the project work. It gives us the ability to obtain permanent financing and then repay the housing production fund and revolve those funds. But because of HOC's commitment, for all of those units, including the market rent, we do abide by the voluntary rent guidelines that our county issues each year. So, you're not going to see a 20 or 30% rent increase, in any of those units.
And I just add quickly that one of the other nice things about creating these 50 and 60% AMI units is you heard from an earlier speaker about trying to pair the voucher, what you pair vouchers with, how to create those new units. So when you get the rents below 50 and 60% AMI, really kind of the FMR and payment standards attached or associated with those vouchers usually will run largely correlated to AMI. So it doesn't matter if you're in a high AMI or low AMI area, that once you're below kind of that 60 and certainly below 50% AMI, vouchers will work there in those units. So these are, we don't build different units for different AMIs. They're all market rate looking units. And now you've got 30% of units where a voucher holder can, the payment standard sufficient.
Very interesting. Any other questions from the committee? Thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate your flexibility and patience with our schedule and